most of you know, we've spent the last several weeks being lifted up by the stories of some of the greatest heroes of the Bible. From Genesis to Revelation, the Bible is filled with the stories of ordinary people who did heroic things through their faith in God. And through God's power, they accomplished some pretty amazing feats. And I believe that their stories can inspire all of us to live like true heroes of God. Throughout this series, we've been inspired by the stories of Noah and Abraham and Jacob and David and Ruth and Samson and Moses. And most recently, last Sunday, we talked about Elijah, a hero who relied on the power of supplication or the power of prayer, who was imbued with superhuman speed and trained a sidekick to replace him after God took him to heaven in a whirlwind. Elijah lived quite a life and was an incredible hero of the faith. Today we're going to meet another great heroine of the Bible, and her name is Esther, the story of Esther. You know, the book of Esther has all the makings of a blockbuster movie. It's got heroes and villains, it's got drama and intrigue and suspense, and even a happy ending. But far from being a modern piece of fiction, those words describe the true story that was lived and written centuries ago. More than just entertaining reading, it is the story of how one woman saved the nation. The book of Esther is set during the height of the Persian Empire. Over a century earlier, the Babylonian Empire conquered and utterly destroyed the kingdom of Judah. And the surviving Jews were all carted away as exiles to Babylon, where they became servants and slaves for the next 70 years. In time, the Persian Empire rose to power and conquered Babylon, freeing all of the Jews. However, because their homeland lay in ruins, the majority of the Jews just continued to live in the kingdom of Persia. They had no other place to go, and so that's where they made their home. And among them was a young girl named Esther. As we explore one of the most captivating and compelling books of the Bible, I want to highlight three aspects of Esther's story and discover how she became a hero to her people. Esther's story begins with her burdens. Esther's burdens. You know, in comic books, heroes are often born out of tragedy. And most people are familiar with the story of Batman. You know, as a young boy, Bruce Wayne happily emerged from a movie theater with his parents, Martha and Thomas Wayne. But as they cut through this alley, you know, a mugger jumps out of the shadows and pulls out a gun, demands their money, but before they can comply, he shoots and kills Bruce Wayne's parents, and he watches his parents die in cold blood. And burdened by the death of his parents, Bruce Wayne swears to wage a war on criminals as Batman. And similarly, you know, Peter Parker was orphaned at a young age, and then further burdened by the death of his uncle Ben, which drove him to eventually become Spider-Man. And of course, Superman is the ultimate orphan, you know, as the sole survivor of his entire planet. You know, when it died and exploded, he was sent to Earth and then adopted and raised here on Earth. Each of these iconic fictional superheroes were orphaned by tragedy, and the same is true of Esther. Esther's parents were among those exiled who chose to remain in Persia. And that decision would not only affect the course of Esther's life, but eventually save the lives of every Jew throughout the far-reaching empire. The Bible sums up Esther's tragic origin story in a few short verses. Esther chapter 2, verses 5 through 7 says this: At that time, there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa whose name was Mordecai. His family had been among those exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. This man had a very beautiful and lovely young cousin, Hadassah, who was also called Esther. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family, and raised her as his own daughter. Now, the Bible doesn't give us any details about Esther's parents or how they died, but regardless of the circumstances, any child that survives the death of her parents endures significant trauma and carries the burden of that pain and loss with them, wherever they go. Traumatized children often experience recurring nightmares, sleep problems, hypervigilance, impaired concentration, anger, depression, and of course feelings of detachment. It's hard for them to form meaningful relationships with others after experiencing such a traumatic loss. And that's a heavy burden to bear. Thankfully, Esther didn't have to bear it alone. Esther's cousin Mordecai took her into his home and loved her as his own daughter. He helped her to cope with her loss. He provided her with a stable home. He showered her with the love of God. Thanks to Mordecai, Esther's burdens didn't destroy her or define her. Rather, she went on to become a capable and courageous young woman, due in no small part to his influence. And as Christians, we ought to do for one another what Mordecai did for Esther. The Bible says in Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Sadly, there is no shortage of orphans in the world today. Countless children are in need of good, godly homes. And the good news is, I don't know if you know this, but 65% of foster and adoptive parents are church-going Christians. 65%, which means that, of course, of people who foster and adopt children, Christians are twice as likely as non-Christians to become adoptive parents. And I think that's good news. I think that speaks well of the church. However, only about 3% of Christians have adopted or fostered children. In the world, all throughout the world today, there are roughly 145 million orphans worldwide. And there are roughly 236 million people in the United States who identify as Christians, which means that American Christians alone have the resources to house every single orphan on the planet, one per household, if only we were willing to be a hero to those children. But even if you're not in a position to adopt or foster a child like Mordecai was, all of us are capable of helping others carry their burdens. By lending a hand and showing someone the love of God, by taking care of those in need around us, we can make a difference. We can be a hero in someone else's story, just like Mordecai. And that is an important, essential step in anybody's life, and especially in Esther's. Because if not for him and his influence, she would not have gone on to become the hero that she was. The next part of Esther's story centers around her beauty, Esther's beauty. After an embarrassing episode that resulted in the king banishing his then-wife, Queen Vashti, King Xerxes was in need of a new queen. And one of his royal attendants, one of his advisors, says to him in chapter 1, chapter 2, I don't know. We'll get there in a second. It's chapter 2, verse 2 and following. Let us search the empire to find beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint agents in each province to bring these beautiful young women into the royal harem of the fortress of Susa. Hige, the king's eunuch in charge of the harem, will see that they are all given beauty treatments. After that, the young woman who most pleases the king will be made queen instead of Vashti. So King Xerxes absolutely loved this idea, and he implemented it immediately. The king's agents scoured the entire empire for the most beautiful women all across the kingdom, and then brought them to the fortress of Susa in order to participate in this competition to win the king's affections. And among the many women who were chosen was, of course, Esther. The Bible says in Esther 2, verse 7, that Esther had a lovely figure and was beautiful. And when Esther and the other women arrived at the palace, they were placed in this special harem where they were supervised by one of the king's eunuchs, this guy named Hege. And the Bible says, again in verse 9, that Hege was very impressed with Esther and treated her kindly. He quickly ordered a special menu for her, probably to provide for the fact that she was Jewish and she couldn't eat all the same things, and provided her with beauty treatments. He also assigned her 7 maids, specifically chosen from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. Now, although Esther was very clearly favored, all of the contestants received 1 year of beauty treatments with oils and ointments and perfumes. They were given fine clothing and jewelry from the king's harem. And then one by one, each of the women spent one evening with the king. They had one chance to make an impression and to win the king's affection. Xerxes' search for a new bride played out like a season of The Bachelor. Just like all of these women just got dolled up and then were like they were part of some beauty pageant. They were brought before the king. They were judged by their bodies and their beauty. And sadly, the world hasn't changed a whole lot. You might not be part of an empire-wide search to become the next queen, but people still judge you by your appearance, don't they? This is especially true, I think, for young women, but it's also true for men and women of any age to one degree or another. In fact, we often do it to ourselves. We look in the mirror and we think you're too short or too tall or too thin or too heavy, your nose is too big, your chin is too weak, your thighs are too fat, you're not pretty enough, you're not handsome enough, etc., etc., etc. And social media, of course, doesn't help. We take selfies at just the right angle in order to make our waist look smaller and our chest look bigger and our face look better. And then, of course, we've got all these different filters that we can choose from before actually posting it online and hoping to get lots of likes and compliments as if our self-image is completely dependent upon the world's approval. The world judges you by your appearance. It always has, and it probably always will. But God doesn't. In fact, the Bible specifically addresses that. In 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, God says to Samuel, "People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Now, while there's certainly nothing wrong with being beautiful, that's not really the most important thing in life. It's what's on the inside that really matters, that makes the difference. The Bible also says in Proverbs 31, verse 30, "Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised." That's the kind of woman that Esther was. Esther's beauty was more than just skin deep because she honored God in her heart. She was beautiful both outside and inside, and people noticed it just by spending time with her. King Xerxes, after he met Esther, he was instantly smitten and spellbound. The Bible says in chapter 2, verse 17, the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen. Through both her outer and inner beauty, Esther won the favor of everyone that she met, including the king, and became the new queen of Persia. But all of this so far is just setting the stage. Finally, the last part of Esther's story focuses on her bravery. Esther's bravery. Esther chapter 3 introduces the villain of the story, a powerful royal official named Haman. Arrogant and prideful, Haman demanded that all the nobles in the kingdom bow down before him whenever he passes by. But he was a cruel man and a sinful man, a wicked man, who fawned and flattered his way into a position of authority and treated the Jewish people who were living throughout Persia with contempt, as if they were second-class citizens. And so Mordecai, Esther's cousin who raised her and cared for her, as a God-fearing Jew, refused to bow before him. And the Bible says in Esther chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. As the highest official in the empire, Haman had the king's ear and the king's trust, allowing him to easily manipulate the king to achieve his own agenda. And so Haman convinces King Xerxes, who was apparently completely unaware of his own bride's ethnicity, that the Jewish people were a plague upon the nation and a threat to their security. Haman's solution to this artificial threat was total genocide, the complete ethnic cleansing of every Jew in the empire. And unfortunately, the easily manipulated king agrees to Haman's perverse plot and allows him to pass a law calling for the wholesale slaughter of every Jew in the kingdom. Now, as one of the king's royal officials, Mordecai hears about this. He gets wind of this plot, and he immediately turns to Esther for help. There was only one thing to do. She had to go to King Xerxes and plead for the lives of her people. But it wasn't that easy. See, in the kingdom of Persia, no one was allowed to enter into the king's presence without being invited. To enter into the king's presence uninvited was to invite execution. If she, even the queen, were to go into his presence uninvited, she was risking her life. If the king wasn't happy to see her, he could order her immediate execution. It was a risky move, but Esther knew there was no other way. She had to do something to save her people. And so she tells Mordecai in chapter 4, verse 16, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. And if I must die, I must die. Fearful but faithful, Esther determined to put her own life on the line to save her people. And after 3 days of fasting and praying, the Bible says in chapter 5, verse 1, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. So there he is sitting on his throne, and he's facing the end of this grand hall. And as she enters the doorway, she steps in with bated breath. This was the moment. This was the determining factor. How was he going to respond to seeing her? Fortunately, as soon as the king saw his beautiful bride, he just lit up. He was excited to see her, and he invited her into the room. He was very surprised that she would come by uninvited, and he's like, why on earth would you risk that? What brought you here? And she tells him that she would like to invite King Xerxes and Haman to a special dinner that she's prepared for them. And so, of course, the two of them attend, and over dinner, Xerxes, of course, knows there's got to be something more important. I mean, she risked her life to come and see me. She needs something more than dinner. And so he asks her in chapter 7, verse 2, tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it's half the kingdom. And so Esther pleads in chapter 7, verse 3 and 4, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. Shocked, Xerxes, like he can't believe what he hears. He jumps to his feet and he's like, who would dare do such a thing? Who would threaten the life of my bride and her people? And Esther replies in the next verse, this wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy. Oh, what I would not give to see the look on Haman's face at that moment. He throws himself on the ground. He grovels at Esther's feet, begging for his life. But the king orders his guards to arrest and execute Haman on the very gallows or spike, depending on the translation, that he intended to execute Mordecai on. And then he passes a new law counteracting Haman's law and saving the Jews from annihilation. Esther became a true hero for God because she bravely risked her own life to save her people. You know, Jesus calls that the ultimate expression of love. In John 15, verse 13, I'm sure you're familiar, he says, "There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends." And to commemorate Esther's bravery and their salvation, the Jews established an annual festival, a celebration called the Festival of Purim, which is still celebrated by Jews all across the globe to this very day. In the wake of these heroic events, Xerxes became beloved by the Jewish people. I mean, everybody loved this guy because he saved their lives. Mordecai was appointed prime minister, one of the highest positions in the entire kingdom. And of course, the king and queen lived happily ever after. By overcoming her burdens with the help of her cousin Mordecai, winning the king's love and affection through her beauty and boldness, and bravely risking her life to save her people, Esther proved herself as one of the greatest heroes of the Bible and set a wonderful example for all believers to follow in many different aspects of our lives. Now, we're nearing the end of our Heroes of the Bible series, but we're not quite done yet. There's one last hero in our lineup. Next week, we're going to shine a light on the greatest hero of all, Jesus. In the meantime, if you're weighed down by some burdens and could use some help carrying them, or if you've been tired of being judged by your outward appearance, I want you to lay your burdens at the feet of Jesus and know that you are beautiful in the eyes of your Creator. And if you could just use some guidance or encouragement, or if you're ready to give your life to Jesus and put your faith in Him, then please come talk with me. Let's stand and sing together, church.